Good afternoon. It's a pleasure this afternoon, June 21, the day of summer starts, to start the summer talking to Professor Joni Hersch of Vanderbilt University about gender issues. And I thought I'd be talking to Joni from Nashville, Tennessee, where Vanderbilt is, but instead she has the good sense to escape the heat in the summer, and she spends it in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, which is a wonderful place to spend the summer. Good afternoon, Joni. How you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Just fantastic. What I want to talk about is a number of questions about gender issues in the workplace. And the first one is, we know that women receive lower wages than men in general. What are the causes of this?
Well, okay, so what's most interesting is that there is a gender gap, we know that, but why the gender gap goes in the direction that it is, in that all the factors that you would expect to predict pay are in favor of women. In terms of women being more educated than men, they are nearly half of the labor force, and their tenure with the employer is nearly as high. So we have a gender gap that's persistent. It's narrowed very little over the past 25 years. And it isn't explained in the United States or in any other country by any of the characteristics that are measurable that you would expect to explain pay disparities. So even controlling, and this is at least 40 years of effort to explain away the gender gap that is in favor of men. You start with education. Well, women have for a long time had more education, but now they have a lot more education. You start with work experience. That was supposed to explain it all away, when women's work experience is very similar to men's by this point, as is their job tenure. You explain it by occupational decisions. Well, when you include differences in occupation, it may explain a little bit more of the gender gap, but it still leaves a large amount unexplained. And then you start throwing in all sorts of other things, such as college major, differences in college major, and then there's a line going into things like testosterone and bargaining and leaning in. Everything you do, no matter what it is you do, you're left with most of the gender pay gap not explained by anything you can measure. Okay, so what does that mean?
Let me interrupt you and ask you about
Yes.
one thing which you said, which I had never thought before. You said there's very little difference in job tenure by gender these days. That wasn't true 25 years ago, I don't think. I think this is a big change. A, because women are staying in the job more, and B, because guys are leaving more quickly. Isn't that also the case?
Yeah, well, one of the less remarked upon changes in the labor force participation is the decline in male labor force participation, which is why women's has increased, but men's has declined, and there's more convergence. But even going way back, women, if men had been paid as bad as women, their turnover rates would have been higher. So women were sticking with jobs even at lower pay, even going back 25 and 40 years. So the persistence with respect to tenure with the employer isn't the source of the gender pay gap.
So you've given me a bunch of negatives, okay?
Yeah, it's not right, okay?
We know a lot of things that ain't producing it.
Right.
But we can't put our finger on anything specific that is producing it. Is that a fair conclusion?
Well, I'm going to give you some reasons.
Okay, fire away. Give me three. Give me the three most important.
The three most important. Okay.
Yeah.
Pay setting practices that are structural, that are not protected by law, but do have the impact of creating gender pay disparities. I'll give all three, and then I'll explain more about these three. Two is, where does the gender gap arises almost immediately. It's narrowest for young people when they're paid the least, but it emerges within a very few years. But in terms of pinpointing the greatest source of the emergence of a pay gap, it is when children arise. So understanding what it is about the appearance of children that causes the pay gap. And then third is actual discrimination. And a lot of this is not employer-based, but is systemic sexual harassment or sex-based harassment that isn't even it can't be protected within the workplace because you don't have an employee-employer relationship, but you do have the effect of contaminating the entire culture, which then feeds back to 1 and 2 in terms of sources of the gender pay gap.
Let's talk about the third thing, as I said in an email, the go-to person on sexual harassment.
Yeah.
Okay. And can you give me just some examples of various levels of sexual harassment? And maybe I can respond, do I think that counts as harassment? And would the average male think that counts as harassment? This is a little bit dangerous, but I think it's a good way to talk. You think that's too crazy?
No. Okay. So what is legally sexual harassment and what would be the kind of sexual harassment that creates inequitable conditions for women?
Excellent.
And
that's the way to think about it.
So legal is very narrow. And, okay, so the reason that workplace sexual harassment is prohibited is because it became over time considered a form of sex discrimination because it affects the ability of victims to do their job and earn what they would earn if they weren't being harassed. But it's a very uneasy fit in the sense that when you're talking about conventional sex discrimination as originally in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act in the United States, other countries have similar laws. But when you're talking about sex discrimination in that context, you're talking about discrimination on the basis of hiring, discharge, promotion, pay, and you have an employer-employee relationship. So the employer actually knows that they're paying men and women different amounts. But you as the discriminated against person can go straight and file a charge of discrimination. Sexual harassment can be done by anybody, your coworkers, your supervisor, a supervisor from another unit, clients, and out in the greater professional world, which I will get to. But the thing about sexual harassment is because it isn't a specific employee-employer arrangement, you as the victim have to report internally first to allow the employer to correct the situation before you can even pursue any kind of legal charge, which means automatically you are set up for retaliation by the mere fact of speaking out. So it goes extremely underreported. And in fact, if you don't make this report, except with very narrow exceptions, your employer, you won't win. Yet, employers avoid liability by saying, or in fact, they usually do, have a reporting and training program in place. And if you don't take advantage of it.
Let me interrupt.
Yeah.
Okay, so look, give me an example of a harassment which would be viewed as at the margin. A reasonable thing.
Okay. Before we get there, can I say that studies show that there's a great deal of agreement on what is sexual harassment. So in surveys, both men and women report things like telling jokes. Obscene jokes are, by agreement, considered sexual harassment. And by law, they are. One time is not. It has to be either severe or pervasive. So severe would be something like attempted sexual assault or actual assault.
Of course.
That's done. It's also criminal. But telling one joke will not be considered to be severe. Telling frequent jokes or viewing pornography on your laptop in the workplace would be considered. Okay, you don't like that.
That's great. Let me ask you this, okay? Let's say I'm a professor at a university, and I tell obscene jokes for fun to female professors.
Mm-hmm.
Is that any different from telling obscene jokes in the presence of junior female professors? Or does the rank difference make any difference at all?
No, it doesn't.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. What if I'm a department chairman and do that? That makes it even more severe, presumably, although you're saying it makes no difference.
Okay, are you, as the department chair, are you the supervisor? Because then if you are the supervisor, you can, the victim can go directly and file a charge. If you're, without having to report. If you, as the professor, but not the chair, your victim would now have to first report it to the chair, who will say, Dan, cut that out. And then a week later, you'll say, oh, it's just a joke.
That doesn't make it.
Well, I mean, it's you. The employer can avoid liability now because the supervisor attempted to rectify the situation, and prevent it. And if you really did stop, it would be over. If a year later, and it can take actually many instances of, I would say, low-level harassment before it reaches the pervasive point, which actually gets you into another trouble because the reporting period is 180 days. And if you're, it may be 300, it depends on state law, but if you start telling jokes and you don't do it again for a month and we agreed it's never going to happen again, and you restart it, and we're waiting because I know if I go to my chair, I'm going to get an 8 o'clock principal's class with 600 students in a windowless lecture room.
Okay.
The period may pass before I even can, where liability is over. I've lost my chance. So, but this is harassment that is sexual in nature. There's also the hostile work environment, which is, interestingly enough, in terms of charges filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, you have, of all the charges filed, 1/6 of them relate to sex-based harassment, where they're about equally divided between sexual in nature and hostility in nature. And while we would think of sex discrimination charges, and we should think of sex discrimination charges as largely being on the basis of things like promotion, hiring, discharge, of all of the charges filed, half of them are actually based on sex-based harassment, either sexual in nature or hostile work environment.
So give me an example of hostile. I mean, obviously, if I proposition my employees, that's clearly this prima facie a no. What about other than these overt acts like that? What could somebody go to the EEOC for as a hostile environment?
Okay, so the prototypical examples you get in the workplace are things like name calling, taunts, making judges women aren't what you think of as racist, but applied to gender instead, in terms of making presumptions and vocally reporting their assumptions about women aren't as good. But actually, we in economics have a very good example, although it wouldn't be covered under sexual harassment law, which is the study that looked at the treatment of men and women in seminars and job talks, which revealed that women were getting more questions more quickly and with more hostility. And if that had taken place, that kind of behavior that would take place with respect to the workplace would in fact be seemingly rise to the level of being illegal, and because it certainly is creating a hostile work environment that is preventing women from fully performing their jobs.
Okay, let me get you go one step further, okay? With a personal experience. In late April, I gave a keynote talk on a conference on the financing of unemployment insurance, sponsored by the Upstart Institute. And one of the things I wanted to do was to talk about various proposals, both right-wing and left-wing proposals. the left-wing proposal would basically abolish unemployment and make it a welfare program. I had on my slide, this is not reform, it's rape.
Okay.
One young woman, not so young in the audience, objected vehemently to this,
Yeah.
put a chat to the entire thing and said, this is outrageous. Now, this is clearly not an employment relationship, but it is an employment environment in some sense, and our conferences are our employment activities.
Yeah.
I changed my slide when they were published. Nonetheless, I thought that was going a little bit overboard. Tell me I'm crazy, I'm a sexist pig. I don't mind it at this age.
Okay, in terms of meeting a legal standard, it wouldn't.
Okay.
So you're fine.
Thank you.
You can do it one time in the workplace.
Okay.
And maybe a second time, but a year later.
No, a year later it'd be okay, but believe me, at this point, it's not worth fighting with people. Okay, yeah. Whatever you want, fine. Okay, that's the point. Okay, do you see any hope of this ending, this changing, other than by increasing legal restrictions, which I don't see happening anytime soon?
Well, there are some efforts to lift legal restrictions that keep sexual harassment underreported to the degree it is. So among the problems here, okay, so what we do understand is that, which comes outside of economics, but it's cultural, the organizational tolerance of sexual harassment. And you can see it basically, I can't even keep track of the daily reports of sexual harassment at the highest levels where the CEO is, removed and lands someplace else.
Right.
So it doesn't, the sanctions are not consequential enough. Their reputational effects are not preventing the sexual harassment from occurring. But what is a problem is that we have so little information in that non-disclosure agreements are quite prevalent, and we don't even know. And some states are considering legislation to prohibit non-disclosure agreements where sexual harassment is concerned. Mandatory arbitration is also very widespread, which is known to favor employers who are the repeat players in arbitration. So, yeah, so we're losing a lot.
Point. Yes, it's a very clever point.
If you want to get even more disgusted, employer practices liability, employment practices liability insurance protects intentional acts of sexual harassment. You would say, why in the world could you insure against an intentional act? And it does. The policies are written to cover. So Harvey Weinstein, all of his payouts and all of his legal bills, and these are, 30 million? It was covered by insurance.
Really?
Really.
Okay, amazing.
So the incentives at the high end are not to limit sexual harassment, but these are things that are easily changed, and there are considerations for making these changes. So there's a little bit of hope in that we can create more incentives to prevent sexual harassment at a level, at the higher levels, which should trickle down. Now, what you do about professional organizations where there is no employment relationship going on is we're trying in economics. We have a survey which revealed an enormous amount of sexual harassment. And we have a profession that has stayed predominantly male without much increase in women. And other occupations, the mining industry has now reported, we've been trying to hire female engineers because due to retirements, we need to tap into the entire workforce. And we are offering flexible jobs, and women report, I don't care. The mining industry, which in fact is the worst in terms of sexual harassment, is why? Why would I? Why? And economics is now, I believe, admitting to its culture that allows for bullying behavior to persist and directed at women, but there's no enforcement mechanism, and unless the old men like you, older men like you,
No,
stop
old,
it.
old, but B, the American Economic Association at this point is run by women. The board is like, there's one black male, the rest are all women. So I don't think we can accuse today's leadership to the extent that it's in power. I just don't think they're very important. It's the institutions that count, frankly, in my view. And the institutions at the top end, in fact, are very pro-female. I think in our profession, the woman at a mediocre school is the one who really takes it in the neck. But I mean, this is interesting. The idea of incentives here, which I'd like to finish up with. Are there any other incentives other than giving people incentives through insurance? I mean, it's an incentive to harass, really. It costs me nothing, and I get the pleasure of the harassment if I'm Harvey Weinstein or Elliot Spitzer or somebody like that.
Right.
Are there any other incentives that are totally goofy like that? That one just blows my mind.
Well, no, I don't know.
Then people, I guess, you get insurance for sexual harassment behavior.
That's right.
Overt acts.
Yeah, that's right.
God, I mean, how would you? It's just amazing to me. I did not know that at all. I am flipped out. Anyway, let me finish up by asking a question. So, at some day, let's say 30 years from now, my granddaughters will be in their early 50s. Will we have seen a reduction in sexual harassment in the workplace? Do you believe, studying this? Final question.
Yes. And the reason I think is that women are in a position to change the household bargain where they end up assuming most of the child care and home responsibilities. And the reason they're in that position is they already out-earn their husbands in about a third of the two-earner households, and they are already more educated, and the fertility rate is going down. And it's actually ridiculous that the balance is still in favor of women doing most of the child care and home responsibilities. Once you eliminate that imbalance and women seize the bargaining power that they have gained, we'll have even more women at the top. Okay. And that, I do think, will change the culture. And in 30 years, I do hope that we will not still be talking about it. But Dan, may I say, I started this about 40 years ago, and I never, ever, ever expected I would still be doing research on gender.
I feel the same way about minimum wages. I did a paper in the early 80s, and the fights, the same damn fights, just keep on going on forever. Nonetheless, I think in the case you're talking about, in the case of minimum wages, we have learned something by all the research people like you and me and so many others have undertaken. So I don't know. I mean, I'm too old to see the future I'm talking about, but I like to think things will be better. I trust you feel the same way.
Right. I do. I hope so.
Okay. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure as always, Joni. Thanks so much. I think we're done.
Thank you.